Hello everyone, welcome to another session of Filmmakers and the Films with Raghvendra sir. Today we're going to be talking about one of the greatest filmmakers that ever lived, Stanley Kubrick.
Now, American cinema, see, Kubrick is a bit of an exception in American cinema, right?
Yeah.
He's not like many other filmmakers. Now, how are American films generally classified in terms of genre, right? Genre is the basic way in which American cinema is, and the most filmmakers, the great filmmakers, Hitchcock, Hawks, Ford, all of them, right? Nicholas Ray, all of them have generally been associated with certain genres, and largely because it's a commercial cinema, and commercial cinema by and large has to generally find its divisions according to audience tastes, right? So that is the reason. Now, I think Wells was one of the few people, because of artistic freedom that he got right from the beginning. Orson Welles was a filmmaker with a much larger, much more freedom. And the same thing goes for Kubrick. For some reason, I think Kubrick got a huge amount of, artistic freedom right from the beginning. So Kubrick is actually he's very distant from the rest of American cinema. You cannot understand Kubrick in terms of the other American filmmakers, or all, even in play Altman, all of them, Lynch. Somehow you can fit them into categories, right? But Kubrick is one person who seems to be a little outside these categories. He's a different, and most of his films seem to be generally adaptations of literature. He makes adaptations of literature, and
So why do you think he was given that kind of an artistic freedom right from the beginning of his career?
I think, I don't know, he was considered one wonderkind, I think, of some sort. Wonderkind he was supposed to be. I don't know exactly what is the thing. Wells, of course, it's because of his this War of the Worlds radio broadcast, and after that radio broadcast, and after that he got it. I think for some reason Kubrick also, he was a photographer. What exactly is the reason? I don't know. I think initially he made one or two movies. The Killing, I think, is
The
a
Killing
genre
and
film. Yeah, it's a genre
yeah,
film. Okay. I think he didn't get it immediately. Spartacus, I think he had a quarrel with Kirk Douglas or some such thing.
yeah,
Spartacus, he made the movie, but he didn't get to the kind of, I think he withdrew or some such thing. For some reason, Kubrick, I think from the Paths of Glory onwards, he seemed to have got his way.
the
Okay.
Paths of Glory was before Spartacus.
Was it okay? But Spartacus, I think he had a quarrel, and after that, okay. After Spartacus, I think Lolita and all that were completely different from American cinema. Okay. Now,
Sure.
he was also largely adapting American films. Okay, he was adapting American films, and adapting American novels, by and large novels. And his novels, you can look at it. I think Clockwork Orange, then something like Lolita of Nabokov's. Then you had this thing, which is that The Shining. They're all novels by and large. So he seemed to have had a big thing adapting novels. Okay. Now, if you classify his films by and large, we look at his films, they generally avoid, generally, shall we say, defeat classification in some way, right? Now, if you classify them, you will find one of the things about his sensibility was he was basically mocking in some way, cold, somewhat very, very acerbic, cold kind of sensibility. And mockery seemed to suit him best. So he was drawn to satire. So Dr. Strangelove, okay, is a satire. Clockwork Orange is a satire. So two solid satires he's made. Apart from that, he's made a couple of anti-war movies. I think one of Parts of Glory is an anti-war movie, and this
Full
thing,
Metal Jacket.
Full Metal Jacket is an anti-war movie. Okay.
Yeah.
Now they are also kind of satirical films. Now the point is, apart from that, it's very difficult to categorize. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to deal only with two satires. I'm going to do two anti-war films, and I'm going to deal with three of his other films. 2001. Just look at the satirical elements. 2001. The Shining and Eyes Wide Shut. My favorite is Eyes Wide Shut, but let's look at his various movies. Okay, now if you look at Strange Love, I think, see, this thing about this class which I'm taking is, I think by and large, most of the people know these films. I don't have to sort of describe these movies and all that, right? These are
True.
movies which everybody knows, and this group seems to be by and large well informed. They seem to know what I'm
And
talking about.
of
What
course,
these films are. Yeah,
everyone's seen Doctor Strangelove.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, everybody's seen Doctor Strangelove. Now, if you look at Doctor Strangelove, it's a nuclear crisis film in which a mad general launches a missile attack on the USSR. Okay, the president of America comes to know about it, tries to stop it, he can't stop it. The Russian head can't be reached, so there's a bit of a problem. Okay, now what I find interesting here is, I won't describe the film. Okay, I find what I found. I saw this film fairly recently. Okay, once again, I mean, I've seen it before. You know, how does Kubrick create the suspense? Right? There is suspense in this movie. Normally, what is the way the suspense is created? Okay, a catastrophe has happened. How to prevent the catastrophe is a normal way of creating suspense, right? You take something like Juggernaut. You take something like, it's not a satire, but I'm saying Juggernaut. Who made it? I think Richard Lester or somebody, right? If you take any of these films, there's a catastrophe about to happen, an explosion about to happen, something is about to happen. The way of normally using suspense, okay, is to take an impending disaster. Is it going to happen? Is it not going to happen? Right? Here, okay, and the emphasis will be on preventing the disaster. Right? If you look at Dr. Strangelove, the emphasis is on creating having the disaster.
True. That
Okay,
it's going to happen.
it's going to happen. It's very very opposite of the normal way in which these disasters are dealt with in film. You know what I got the feeling was, and even the final ending when the disaster is not, and he has this music, very incongruous. We'll meet again. That song is there, and it's no, the point is it's funny. Okay, there's a lot of funny stuff in the movie. It's not that it's not funny. There's one, for instance, I thought the funniest thing in the whole movie was that guy, the military officer played by Peter Sellers.
Yeah.
Okay. He's trying to make a phone call to the president. He's trying to make a phone call and he doesn't have a coin and he breaks the Coca-Cola machine to get some coins, right? And
Yeah.
that guy says, "You're answerable to the Coca-Cola company." That I found hilarious. Okay. I mean, there are extremely funny bits. Peter Sellers as the president, Peter Sellers as the officer, British officer, Peter Sellers as the
Dr. Strangelove.
yeah, Dr. Strangelove. All that is very funny. That the what is it called, ex-Nazi and all that stuff, always can't keep his hand under control. It's all very funny, but the point is, where is Kubrick looking at the whole world from? Where is he taking his position?
From a very pessimistic point of view.
No, it's not pessimistic. See, you've got to understand this. See, the point is, he doesn't care. See, pessimism and optimism, okay, are both done with concern, right? Which pessimism is not without concern. Okay. Kubrick here doesn't care. No, the point is he's serving mankind from some, from some extraterrestrial thing, from somewhere else, from another planet. Where is he looking at mankind from? Now, this is a very strange thing. I mean, yeah, let's look at satire. Okay, let's look at Animal Farm, right? And let's look at Animal Farm, Orwell's Animal Farm. We know, okay, that Orwell's sympathies are with the animals, but the question is, what he's regretting in the film is that their experiment in starting a farm themselves, becoming independent of man, that thing is failing. Okay, so his sympathies are, you know who it is, and there is that boxer, the horse, and all that. So the question is, his sympathies, you know where the sympathies are. It's the same thing. You look at Catch 22, for instance. If you look at Catch 22, it is obviously with Yossarian. Will Yossarian get out of the war before he is killed? Right. That is the basic thing. So there's a yearned for a scenario which all these films are generally hoping to, yearn for scenario. You know that this is good, that is bad. Pessimism is it works out badly. Optimism is it works out well. But what is desired is always positive, right? In this particular thing, there is no sense that Kubrick deserves desires the saving of mankind. In fact, he's building up suspense, works at the opposite thing, right?
Yeah, that's going to happen. We know that's
It's going to happen. And not only that, he's building suspense, towards the catastrophe, and doing against all odds, the catastrophe, things come in the way. Like, normally what is the thing? When the catastrophe is about to happen, okay, we try to prevent it, and the question people are trying to prevent it. Anything, I mean, any kind of thing you can take, like that one. I think that were the hijackers on a plane trying to blow it up, trying to do all those kinds of movies, right? All of them have this thing of you're preventing a catastrophe from happening, and it's told from the other side. Here it's told from those people who want to destroy the world. It's told from their perspective, right?
Yeah, the
It's told from
suspense
a,
is
yeah,
always
it's
there.
completely perspective is
At
different.
what moment is the doomsday gonna actually happen?
Yeah, but the point is you don't care. The important thing is that he's drawing suspense from this way. He's placing himself. If the world is going to be destroyed, where is he placing himself? Now there's a question. Now the question is that kind of approach, is it justifiable? No, I would say no. Okay, Kubrick, for all the humor of his film, for all the satire, he's taking his, some other planet or something. He's looking at mankind as insects in something, yeah, as insects are being studied from somewhere else, kind of thing. He's not taking his position in the world, he's taking his position somewhere else. You can't, I think, I would say that the ending itself is invalid, that kind of thing, of laughing at the destruction of the world. You can't laugh at it. I mean, it doesn't, it makes you uncomfortable. How is this happening? Where is he looking at it from? What is his perspective? Okay, I won't go
I
further
mean,
here.
he's making a mockery out of the whole thing. I mean,
What
like
is he
why
making?
is
Look, mockery, agreed, Baba. I know that he's making a mockery of it. But the question is the perspective of any artist has to be human perspective, right?
I mean,
Okay.
is that
It has to,
necessary?
yeah, it has to be a human perspective. All things is a human perspective. It need not be a national perspective. Look, this is the thing. He is not, it can be see, outside the nation, it can be, but it cannot be outside humanity. You get my point, okay? Your perspective cannot be outside humanity. It can be outside a nation, it can be outside the community. You can make fun of India being outside India. You can make fun of America being outside America. You can do all that. You can't make fun of humanity being outside humanity. Okay, you have to take your place within humanity. Let's look at the second film. Just, I'm saying, just to get a sense of what Kubrick is doing, how he keeps continuing to make this kind of stuff. It could be called misanthropic. Okay, it's a misanthropic view. And it's, I mean, regardless of how funny it is, it's a view of somebody who's placing himself outside humankind, right? Now let's look at Clockwork Orange. Okay, the other satire. Now, I don't want to say what Clockwork Orange is about. Everybody should evidently know what it's about. It's set in the future. Youth gangs are running amok. The hero Alex is arrested, put through some therapy by which any thought or violence fills him with nausea. He loves Beethoven, okay, but his conditioning makes him abhor Beethoven, and so he's filled with nausea, vomiting, and this and that whenever he hears Beethoven. Okay, now, okay, finally, he's cured because the opposition party comes and something happens, and he's cured of this, and he goes back to becoming a thug. Now, if you look at the novel, of Burgess, this guy grows up in some way. I mean, he makes individual choice. The thing is choice, right? Individual choice. You should not be coerced into moral choices like this, fake choices like this, which you must be actually be allowed to choose morally whether what is good and what is bad. It's a kind of thing. It's a celebration of the right to choose in some way. That the faith is that you will, when you're given a right to choose, at some particular point you will realize that the right to choose is a human choice, right? Now, in this film, including the important thing is including Alex's victims, that cat lady and all that, there's not a single positive character. I mean, there is nothing like a positive character, including what's it called, the beggar whom he kicks, right? Beggar,
Yeah,
he's singing
yeah.
something, he's drinking, and he's kicking, right? So the question is, everybody in the film, there is nobody who has who's some worthy of emulation, or some sort of worthy of saving, or worthy. It's a position once again taken outside from somewhere else. Okay, Alex is a thug, a complete thug. Okay, and let's look at his use of music, right? Okay, now in the original thing, he uses Teutonic music, right? Teutonic music is the German kind of German music, and the basic thing is he's making thing of fascism, right? The fascists could appreciate music and at the same time do all kinds of things. Is basically Burgess's thing. Here he doesn't. It's no longer Teutonic. Rossini is there. Okay, he uses Thieving Magpie of Rossini. He uses other music. He uses all kinds of music, right? Now the point is, if you say that no artistic thing is worth anything. The world's artistic achievements are worth nothing. What is Clockwork Orange worth? Okay. If there is no affirmation of any sort, if there's no affirmation, look, I can't believe, okay, I don't know if any of the participants can answer this question. Is it possible not to affirm anything at all in a work of art? Any human thing in a work of art, there is nothing worth in humanity worth
See,
saving. If you
there's
take that position,
agree, like there's obviously something that is worth affirmation, but is there something that has to be affirmed in a work of art? Now
no,
that is
no, no, no.
something.
You have to find some position there, a human position, and not outside humanity. There is no position outside humanity, right? There is no position outside humanity. So you can't very well take a position outside humanity and say something. Something has to be affirmed. Okay, there has to be an affirmation of some sort because you are making a movie. You are making something as a human being, right? There
But
has
of
to
course,
be, yeah.
but the position that he's taking, of course, like say, like even outside humanity, and the view is like that, but he's not making like he's giving you a sense of affirmation and giving you hope that, okay, like in the end Alex says that, okay, I was cured, all right. He says that very ironically before
I was
the end.
cured, all right. He
Yeah,
no, that he
he
was
says
no,
that.
no, that is before. No,
So he's
finally, when he's cured of the final thing, okay, when he's cured of the final thing, he's not. Doesn't become a
I know.
Beckett.
So
No, no. See, wait a minute. See, Beckett is almost from despair, right? See, when you take a position which here it's mockery. Beckett is almost from it's a this thing of despair. It's a deeply despairing situation, right? It's hardly mockery. But where is Beckett? Like, let's take something like let's take something like which is that other that woman. I mean, I don't know. He keeps going to lower and lower. She's trying to be cheerful. It's obviously talking about false cheerfulness. What is that film? I mean, the woman is buried up to her neck and she goes deeper and deeper and deeper. Happy something, I forget. But the point is that it's all said and done. It is not lofty mockery. Beckett is never lofty mockery. This guy, Kubrick, there's a certain loftiness as if he's taking his position outside mankind, outside humanity, right? I won't say mankind, humankind, right? The point is, such a position is not permissible in our time. Saying you have to have look. The whole point is, if you say art is useless, if you say music is useless, it has no moral value, it has no value of any sort. Then the question you will ask is, what is your film worth, right? It's a question you have to ask.
okay, so let's take a
You
scene from
have to
Clockwork
take
Orange.
look any work of art, including the film itself, right? The film has to be seen as the film itself needs to be affirmed. Okay, we have to take Clockwork Orange is itself in need of affirmation. If it's seen in need of affirmation, where is it going to be affirmed from? Is the question I would like to ask. Okay,
See, see, in Clockwork Orange, halfway through the film, we do get a sense of that maybe there is some affirmation for this guy,
it's not
but
by the end of it. Nothing. There's
that's what I'm
nothing at the
saying.
end.
It's not like there's no affirmation. He gives you affirmation and he takes away that hope.
No, no, it doesn't.
So,
It takes away. But there's no hope. I'll tell you what. We expect affirmation of some sort because you can't exist without affirmation. So there has to be some kind. The parents are not an affirmation. That lodger is not an affirmation. The victims are not an affirmation of some sort. Look, when you portray victims like the cat woman, that beggar, and all that in such a disgustingly, what is a caricatured way. Okay, you are virtually saying that whatever happens to them, they deserve to get, right? You're virtually saying that. Okay, that phallic thing that woman has, I mean, which says it's high art, again caricature, it's mockery. Okay, I mean, there is simply no positive thing in this
but
movie.
don't you think because he could take that stand only because he was kind of adapting a story which is not set in the world that he was living in at that point?
No, the point is, like, all films, all novels written about the future, okay, are actually set in the present. They're dealing with present day situations, right? They're not really. So the question is, you're not talking about the future, you're talking about the future as seen from the present, right? Okay,
True.
and it's the present which is the issue. It is not ever the future, right? You take anything, you take any science fiction, you take the Morlocks and the Alloy and Time Machine. What are you talking about? You're talking about the proletarians today, what has happened, likely to happen to them in future, because the present conditions in the present, that's what you're talking about. So this entire thing of future is not really future at all. It's the future as seen from now. and the conditions of the present which what do you say, which will take care of the future. Okay, I won't say any more of this. Let's go along to this. Let's look at some of the other things. Okay, now the both these films, you look at them, they are about humanly designed systems, device systems. Okay, the failure of humanly designed device systems. There's a certain machinery of some sort, like you've got the entire machinery in Doctor Strange Love to prevent war, to protect from each other. But the basic thing is the failure of, you could say that Kubrick in film after film after film was talking about humanly devised systems failing. This is basically his theme. In both these films, these anti-war films, both these satires, that is the case. But the question is, I'll tell you, when you want to sort of regret the failure, it has to be regret, the failure of a humanly devised system. You have to humanize. You must show the presence of human beings with their imperfect human beings struggling against odds to save the system. In fact, his entire one of the problems with his films is there are no human beings in his films, right? There are no human beings at all. Who are the human beings in A Clockwork Orange? There are no human beings, right? They're
Mm.
all caricatures of some sort.
Wouldn't you say that Alex is in a way
No,
humanized
where is he? How is he human? Like,
by the
yeah?
by the end, like
No, he's not. The ends with this fellow going back to his old ways.
but in the middle, when we
No, look,
actually
wait a
feel
minute.
that okay, his moral
No,
choice has
no, but the point is this. The question is this. When he's kicked and beaten by his former cronies, okay, we are not in sympathy with this guy. Just got it. He goes crying and all that, and then those fellows who are his victims now jump upon him and do the same thing. I won't go further into this discussion. I think whatever, if you've got something, I mean, there is no positive counterpoint at all. So this, what's his name? This Alex is that way. Okay. Now let's look at his anti-war movies. Let's look at Paths of Glory. Now let's look at Paths of Glory, right? Now, Paths of Glory is all the elements of satire. It's made up with all the elements of satire. I find one question I want to ask. Okay, this is obviously with Kirk Douglas's the big role to play in the movie. I want to ask a question. If okay, these fellows are given such a suicidal mission, if they're given such a suicidal mission to accomplish, which is simply not possible at all, how is it that the Kirk Douglas character suffers nothing at all? Kirk Douglas character just rushes through with a whistle and all that. He's rushing through. It's as if he's the only superhuman being among them. What is he exactly? What is the Kirk Douglas character? Is he human or is he not human? What does he suffer? He seems to be always above, right? He seems to be always above the rest somehow. What exactly is he human at all? Where is he positioning himself? Where is he? How is he? Now, if Kirk Douglas is so bold and so this thing to rush out and then go ahead of everybody else and still not be, still be in full this thing, why are the other guys suffering? How is he so bold? How is he so courageous? No, I suspect that in this particular film, they've made this what's his name, Kirk Douglas figure again, some kind of Superman kind of thing. I mean, he's not really a Superman, but he doesn't
savior
subject
kind
him.
of a thing.
He
Yeah.
does not subject him to any of the dangers, any of the things that the other people are subjected to, right? He does that. And I've got another problem with this. What exactly, like, it's always done through this Kirk Douglas figure in the film. What is the end of the thing? That song which that woman sings. He's not even there, right? He's not even watching that. Okay,
He just
how
says
is it
that.
that perspective has changed altogether? What is that perspective change? What is he doing? I don't know. I have some serious problems with this one's anti-war film. See, before we go into this, what exactly an anti-war film, right? Any pacifist film is not an anti-war movie. You take something like Thin Red Line. Is it an anti-war film? See, because in Thin Red Line, what they're affirming is camaraderie, courage. These are the things they're affirming. Now, the point is, it may not be pro-war. It's not a jingoistic war movie, but still it's a war movie in the sense. See, for example, there's a deserter. I forget his name. John Casaviel, I think, is the direct actor, and there is that fellow is a deserter. Finally, joins and he dies in the war, fighting a battle. Right? He's fighting. He's killed valiantly. He gives his life in the war. So the question is still a war. It's a pacifist war movie, but it's not an anti-war movie. This one is a anti-war movie, straightforward. But which one? Your anti-war movies are basically, they don't find any any what do you say, redeeming qualities in war at all. Something like Spielberg's War Horse. World War One movies are anti-war. World War Two movies are usually not anti-war. They usually, in some kind of way, they affirm war as a field of courage, as a thing of camaraderie, of of sacrifice and that sort of thing. By and large, anyway, it's so the question is: this is an anti-war film, all right? It works at some particular level. But if this Colonel Dax can lead the attack heroically and not die, why are the other men unable to? We ask this question, right? Again, this Colonel Dax, I mean, his is the perspective in the film. I don't know what exactly they think. This, Kirk Douglas was a big star then, and he had a liberal image. Okay,
Yeah.
he had a big liberal image.
Yeah.
So they've used this. Yeah, they've
At the
used.
peak of the studio system, that film was made. Yeah.
Yeah, correct. So that is the basic thing of Colonel Dax. So I have some doubts about this Colonel Dax. All right, what exactly? The closing song again is a problem with this film. I won't go further into this. On Full Metal Jacket. Okay, when you go into it, it's again, Full Metal Jacket is fully along with this thing of the failure of human systems. The first half is, I mean, it's brilliant. There's no doubt that this makes World War II movies are not anti. By and large, yes, you're right. World War II movies are by and large not anti-war movies, but Catch 22 is a World War movie, World War II movie. Catch 22 is an anti-war movie. Okay, so Catch 22, it's a rare case of World War II film. I find this interesting in Europe. Sorry? Okay. Okay, I'm not able to get that. Anyway, whatever it is, Catch 22 is set in the World War II. It can't be called a war movie. It's a satire, and it uses World War II for its satirical impact. But by and large, because in World War II, the moral, shall we say, divisions were quite clear, good versus bad and that sort of thing, right? Vietnam War didn't have that. World War One didn't have that clear. In fact, I would say that World War Two, in many ways, simplified history for the general public. Okay, see, for example, you take communism, you take the Soviet Union. There are many who are completely on the side of Soviet Union, on the side of communism. There are those who are against it. The right wing is against it. This is not true of Hitler, because Hitler lost the war. More than a complete evil, he lost the war. There was a consensus on Hitler being evil. There's no consensus on anybody else being evil, right? Everybody else. Okay, it's anti-war in the Pacific. It's not anti-war in Europe. I don't know, because I think even German movies are anti-war movies. German war movies. You look at that one, the submarine film. I forget what it's called. U-boat something. This chap. I don't. There's one film. U-boat film, submarine film. The German war movies are anti-war. Das Boot. Yeah, Das Boot is an anti-war film. It's not a war film at all. He doesn't affirm anything in that thing. Some of the other ones also. German movies are always. French war movies are anti-war movies, right? No, not they're also. I mean, they're war movies, but they're again this thing of Americans. I mean, American films are obviously are a different breed from. But there's always some kind of affirmation. Actual war. I don't mean prisoner of war films like Herman Melville. What's his name? Melville, Jean-Pierre Melville's films and all that. Okay. Coming back to this, coming to Full Metal Jacket. In Full Metal Jacket is another film which has to do with what is the thing? It has to do with this training imparted. The first half has to do with training imparted to soldiers to make them killing machines, and again a human system. It's again about the failure of human systems. When after all this thing in the training camp, they made perfect killing machines. Okay, they are made perfect killing machines. They go to Vietnam War, where the chaos of Vietnam gets them, the Tet Offensive and all that gets them. So it's a failure of when they're actually set into a real situation. Okay, but the point I find it interesting. A question I would like to ask is, why is it that in the training camp, the number of people, Private Joker, Private Pile, right? Why is it that Private Joker and Private Pile do not comfort each other? Why is Private Pile not comforted by Private Joker? He's not. Okay.
Yeah.
Like, there is no communication between the soldiers. There's no effort at humanizing them in some way. Like, there's no effort at humanizing this you remember who I know? Private Joker is
Yeah,
the protagonist, right?
yeah.
Private Pile. Why is it that Private Pile is not comforted in some way by Private Joker? Private Joker remains some kind of inhuman thing, though individually we may have sympathies with these people. We have sympathies. Why is it that sense of one person, and why are they not humanized? I find that a very serious issue. That okay. That this issue of private Joker and Pyle, it's an important thing. I find that quite disturbing that he doesn't humanize it. So when they go to Vietnam, all right, when they go to Vietnam again, the entire the point is this Kubrick's view of where he looks at anything from is always a little suspect. He seems to be taking his position somewhere. Somewhere outside outside the field he's surveying. And the point is, even this is not it's not American. Of course, actually, in some sense you could say your Vietnam War actually, it's no longer, it works better. One of the reasons that this thing works better than something like than
Lots of glory.
Paths of Glory or the other two satires is that you could say that he's taking his position outside Americans, outside America in some way, okay, because there's still a position. And there is that, the Viet Cong or whoever, the woman, the sniper and all that, so that element is still there. So they're outside America is not and cannot be seen as misanthropic. But I would say that this thing that within the camp, the fact that Private Pyle is not in any way comforted by Private Joker, as just simply as human listening courtesy extended to another person, considering that Private Joker is actually a decent fellow, right? He's
Yeah.
a good guy. Okay. This is a moral vision. In spite of having a moral vision of some sort, okay, Private Joker does not comfort Private Pyle. Now, this is the issue I would like to raise. Okay. Any questions up to here? Anybody has any questions? It seems to be that Kubrick's mocking vision or whatever seems to be placed outside the plane he's examining, always outside, right? So the question is, it's all right, acceptable up to a certain point, but when that plane becomes humanity, right? If that plane is America, it is a nation, it is a something like that, right? Then it's okay. But when that plane becomes humanity, okay, it becomes a problem, right? So it becomes an issue. So this is the point I want to make. Okay, now let's go to his. Should we go to the next slide? Now, 2000 and thing Space Odyssey is an interesting film. Okay, uh, the thing about 2001 Space Odyssey is it's interesting that it begins somewhere in the
Prehistoric
in prehistoric times, and there's some ape men or something there, ape men or some people who are the important thing I find is that these ape men, okay, they are suddenly, that change in the status of the ape man from ape to man, okay, happens when they see the what is that called, the slab, right?
the monolith.
Monolith, yeah, the monolith. When they see the monolith, that is when that apes become men. And when they become men, what is the first thing they do?
They find
What is the
the
first thing they do when they become men?
they
They
hunt.
kill,
They kill.
right?
Yeah, they hunt. Yeah.
They do not use these bones as anything except as weapons. So this, I think, Kubrick was saying that man became man when he learned to kill other men, right? Okay. So the basic thing is the capacity for war, which made human beings human. That is the basic thing. Okay. So now that seems to be the thing. A recurring idea in thing that violence, the capacity for violence against each other. You look at first also, you look at Dr. Strangelove. Okay. You look at Dr. Strangelove. You look at what is the other one? Full Metal. All of them is this capacity to kill, which somehow, and which somehow, Kubrick is sort of judging on the thing of mankind's humankind's propensities with this capacity for war. Okay. Now, I found this very interesting. When you see the thing for capacity for war, okay, the 2001, what happens is, okay, these human beings, when he shows human beings, I don't know if you guys noticed this. I mean, you can ask the others also here. You look at the astronauts, they're photographed in a way which makes them look alike, right?
Yeah.
They're alike, right?
Symmetrical.
They have the same kind of faces, they're alike. The scientists look alike. They conduct themselves alike, they speak in the same way. Okay. This is very interesting that he's basically talking about this doesn't seem to attract too much notice, that he's talking about human beings homogenized into some kind of mechanical devices of some sort. You remember that scene where the scientist is ringing up his home or so, when he's ringing up his home, the way the daughter behaves in that situation? Oh, she's not interested in this father at all. She's also behaving like a mechanical model, right? Okay. She's mechanical. So the whole thing is, it seems to me, he's talking largely about humanity having lost its individuality in some way. Human beings are becoming automatons. And the most interesting human being of them all is HAL 9000.
HAL 9000.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, it is also interesting that the only one with the capacity for violence is HAL 9000. Okay. So it looks like that in the future, in this particular future, that mankind has finally become homogenized in some way. And finally, all their capacity for violence has been now invested in the computer, right? In the computer. And that computer is mad in the sense it's mad in the sense it's capable of this, it's capable of killing, it's able to do that. I never, when I saw it the first time, figured out why this HAL 9000 went mad. I still haven't figured out. Do you know why HAL 9000 why did it go mad exactly? I can't
Why
see.
did it happen?
Is there any logical reason for why HAL 9000 broke up? What was the reason for it? There's no reason given at all, is there? Does anybody in the audience know why HAL
the
9000
mission is being jeopardized, but why does the computer give?
computer go mad? We don't know. Okay, we don't know why the computer went mad, right? It's an issue, right? So my own sense is that the computer is basically become human. The human beings in the process of becoming what do you say, of have finally invested, I don't know, made up till mankind that it's possible that it's the best computer made till then. But the important thing is that it seems to be humankind's capacity for but the point, planning to shut it down. They're planning to shut it down later when it starts behaving badly. Okay, not initially. Why does it go mad in the first place? Why does it start, observing? I don't know what it is. It seems to be that mankind has transferred its own capacity for violence into this computer. This computer has got all the propensities of humankind. Without humankind itself has become like a machine. I don't know what it is. I don't know. I'm still not convinced that that computer had to go mad. I see it only as emblematic of the fact that humankind has invested its greatest creation in terms of everything with all its capacity for destruction, capacity for violence. That is the thing. Okay, now I want to ask another question here. Okay, the important thing is, okay, now, what is one to make of that entire, shall we say, beyond infinity thing? What exactly? I believe it is supposed to be the most optimistic ending ever seen in cinema or some such thing. Steven Spielberg said, right? Ever seen in cinema. That's what Spielberg. Now, what exactly is this when you say that mankind cannot be saved except by external agencies, right? What is this thing doing? He's saying aliens will have to come and save mankind in some way. That is the optimism.
I mean, it's emblematic. It's emblematic of a divine intervention as well. I mean, if you want to look at it that way.
Yeah, which means man can't save himself, right?
Isn't that what's like? Yeah, I mean, yeah, in a way.
I mean, is that optimistic? I don't know. I mean, is that optimistic? If mankind cannot save itself and it has to rely on divine, let's call it divine. It's perfectly acceptable.
And it's not even being saved. It's being evolved into something else, like starting.
Evolution through external agency.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the question is that slab or whatever, that monolith has to keep coming down. It comes for the first time when the things are there. Then so it's always guiding mankind in some direction, right?
True.
Yeah, correct. You're right. Close encounters is again divine intervention. But close encounter, yeah, it is also. In fact, I look at Close Encounters, that last scene in those things coming down, like Sant Tukaram, the Pushpak Vimana coming down
away,
and taking the what's his name, Tukaram, away, Pushpaka Vimana. What this guy does is also right, but there is nothing in Close Encounters to say that mankind is being saved by them. Okay,
Yeah.
they've not gone into some superhuman race or whatever. I don't know where this Kubrick got this superhuman thing. Okay, it may be Nietzsche or whatever, the Ubermensch or whatever. Maybe he may have got it from there. I really don't know what that is. I'm not familiar with that Ubermensch. I know it had some Superman. I don't know what to make of that entire thing. But the point is this: that virtually once that spectacle of that the lights and all that starts, the story is over, right? There is no more film actually. Okay, it's just that is the end. Rest of it is complete spectacle. The thing completely stops. Everything stops at that particular point. After that, there is no story, nothing to be interpreted. There's nothing, no room for interpretation, except as some vision that I don't know what to make of that. Again, where is Kubrick looking at mankind from? Is again question. Where is he looking? This is always, it is always a problem with Kubrick. Where is he surveying humankind from? So that is my entire issue with Kubrick. Okay, now all these movies are once again humankind based movies. 2001 is again a humankind based movie, so it's an issue. The other last two movies I'm going to deal with, The Shining and
Eyes Wide
Eyes
Shut.
Wide Shut, are America, right? Both
Yeah.
are America. Now he's completely immune to such charges, because now he's talking about now all you have to say is he's no longer surveying this. He's not surveying it from America. He's looking at a certain thing of America. Now let's look at which I like. I think Shining is one of my favorite films. Okay, the point about 2001, which I'd like to ask is there irony? No, is there irony in Kubrick making fun of this? Is he making fun of this whole idea of mankind's future is destiny? It's too grand to be irony, I think. I think it's far too grand to be irony. So I would take him that Kubrick is slapping on some kind of metaphysical ending or some kind of mystical ending in which he himself doesn't have too much, too much faith. That is the sense I get. What about the people in the participants? What do they feel about Kubrick? Any ideas on this? I mean, how is 2001? Because it's generally considered one of the great films of all time. I mean, this is a serious issue for me. What exactly is Kubrick doing? I mean, he's not got uniform praise. It's not that his praise has been uniform, but he's got such a wide, fan following as a filmmaker, that this is become an issue. Anyway, you can talk to it at the end. Now let's look at this, The Shining. Now, The Shining is supposedly a haunted house thriller, right? It's a haunted house thriller. Jack Torrance is an aspiring writer. His wife Wendy and their son are shut up in the winter as caretaker. This is the basic thing, okay? But I will look upon it as something, okay? What does the milieu represent? What does Jack Torrance represent? Now, if you take Jack Torrance, aspiring writer, okay, haunted by inner demons, who's done all kinds of things, who's almost killed his son in the past, had a drunken thing, okay, it seems to correspond to some kind of caricature of the modernist writer, right?
Yeah.
Modernist, it's a kind of caricature of the modernist writer. And what is this thing that he's trapped inside?
Postmodernism.
Yeah, that's it, he is actually a modernist writer trapped in postmodernism. You understand something? We talked about failure of human systems, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, the Overlook Hotel, where Jack Torrance is trapped with his wife and child, is actually, okay, that Overlook Hotel is all the excesses of postmodernism, right? Okay, excessive consumption. In fact, that entire thing, the larder and this and that, is basically one of the things of post. I mean, it's a kind of postmodern excess. It's a thing of plenty. Okay, it's consumption, right? So the question in that particular thing, if you take the Overlook Hotel as a human desire, as a human system, it's again human devised system which fails at some point, right? Okay. Now, if you take the Overlook Hotel as a as a humanly, I mean, devised by human beings, as a system devised by human beings, okay, what are the ghosts? Just look at the ghosts, okay. You must remember one thing, okay. Wendy is not affected by the ghosts.
This
It's
is
only
Jack is
Jack
affected.
Torrance who is affected by the ghosts, okay. So we could say that Jack Torrance is a misfit in the Overlook Hotel. Wendy is not.
Can be.
It's also a
Yeah,
fact.
can be.
Wendy is not a misfit in the over. I don't know what to make of the boy. The boy seems to, boy himself not really threatened in the film. He seems to have, there are a
But he
lot of
has,
things.
but he has the shining. Like
He has The
he,
Shining. Yeah, but I don't know what to make of that. See, the point is this, right? Kubrick has always got these things which you can't explain. All his films will always contain something. I said that, like why Kirk Douglas should be some superhuman in the middle of all this. There's no explanation for that. There's no explanation for eyes. What is this? Full Metal Jacket. Many of the things, right? Why does this happen? Why does that happen? This kind of thing seems to keep happening all the time. This lack of explanation for his films. So I think this Overlook Hotel, the boy also, he sees that blood coming down, right? He sees the blood coming down from the elevator. What is that blood exactly? I don't know what that blood is. What is it doing there? It doesn't correspond to anything at all except a kind of visual stimulus of some sort. But my own reading is to look upon Jack Torrance as a modernist writer trapped in postmodernity, and these ghosts actually are not ghosts but manifestations of the failed system, right?
manifestations as in.
The manifestations of the failed system. Like, why is it that Wendy is perfectly comfortable in postmodernity? I mean, you can see, take that. She's a postmodern creature, right? Okay. And let us look at that scene where he chases her up the staircase. Let's look at that scene where he chases her up the staircase. Okay. Everything he says to her, Wendy, light of my life. Okay, what is that? What good a few
Wendy,
more
darling,
moments
light of my life.
do you now? You have valued whole. You had your whole life to think things over, right? Now, if you look at that entire situation, you will find, okay, that everything he's saying is completely rational. Correct? He is making sense. Jack Torrance is making sense in The Shining. It is Wendy who's banal, Wendy who's an idiot, Wendy who's made fun of, right? The point is, obviously, I would say that Kubrick's things here is with modernity. His sympathies are with modernity, okay, which has no chance it's postmodernity. In fact, I was going to use the word postmodern. You came along, you said it before me. But this postmodern, I don't know if all of you among the audience knows what postmodernity is. Postmodernity is not some higher system over modernity. It's a negation of modernity. It is all the, what do you say? It is all the, shall we say,
Elements of
the
modernity
elements
only
that were turned into game. Okay,
turn into game.
it's
Yeah.
turned into a game, right? So postmodernity is not. I mean, I'm modern. If supposing I'm a modernist, somebody says, "Oh, I'm a postmodernist," his level is actually lower than yours. Okay. Postmodernity is not an improvement upon modernity. The point is, people don't seem to know what modernity is. So the question is that they seem to think that there is no, for example, there is no such thing as postmodernity. There is no such thing. Okay, you can't go beyond. It's not some kind of hierarchy in which you go further and further up. Okay, so postmodernity is not a hierarchically above modernity. Modernism is the high point of culture, in as far as we are concerned, because it was the introduction. It was the high point of culture of a certain sort. With Picasso, with Einstein, with all these guys contributed to the modernism. Postmodernism is a shall we say down. It's a lower level. So your what's her name? Your Wendy,
Wendy.
completely banal. She is. She has nothing to say. Actually, I mean, it's slightly, misogynistic. Has been accused of being misogynistic. And I'll say this, that Stephen King, who made this movie, didn't like it at all.
Yeah,
Didn't
yeah.
like it at all, right? And he found Wendy completely obnoxious. Wendy is actually, again, it's to use her physical, what her physiognomy, what she looks like. If you look at Altman's Three Women, for instance, and look at her there and look at her here, it's somewhat similar role, but here he's mocked ruthlessly, absolutely mocked, ruthlessly.
And it goes on deteriorating over the duration of the film.
Yeah, it gets worse and worse and worse. So the question is, you look at this, the entire thing, okay. There are, of course, many incongruities which I can't explain at all. How is that ghost able to, the locked up Jack Torrance, how does the ghost manage to get, I mean, when has the ghost ever intervened people like that? Okay, how can it get the guy out by unlocking the door, that sort of thing, right? That kind of thing is incongruous. I don't know what to make of it. How does the ghost let this guy out? Okay, let out this locked person and allow him to go. No, I mean, so these inconsistencies that you find are always there in Kubrick. You look at any film of his, there are inconsistencies. There are things which you can't explain. No explanation. That he seems to be, I mean, oblivious. He's meticulous in his technical thing, but there are incongruities which you can't explain at all. This is one of the things. Okay. So the question is, once again, you can take the fact that Wendy does not see the ghost as some kind of indication that she is fully at home in. I don't know if she sees it, but the point is, it doesn't affect her very much. It hardly has any effect upon her. It's an indication that she's fully at home in this post-modernity of the Overlook Hotel. Jack Torrance is a modernist writer who's suffering, who's a drunkard, who's this all these things of the modernist writer. Okay, he is basically out of place there, which is why finally he's a tragic character who dies there when he goes completely bonkers and he's unable to do anything. He's the one person, one casualty there. Okay, of course there are other guys that like the person who has the other shining thing. So you can't. That is one of the things about him. He adapts movies. He adapts book novels. He adapts novels. He does not adapt. He adapts them fairly faithfully, but doesn't adapt them in certain places. So why he is being faithful in some places, why he's not being faithful in other places is difficult to say. So there are obviously my interpretation of The Shining will be difficult to account for every single thing. He is not meticulous in his treatment of the. He's meticulous in his technicalities, in the way he shoots his films. And look at that thing, the emblem, the carpets, right? It has a sort of, it has a thing of a trap, right?
Yeah, the patterns. Yeah.
Pattern is that of a trap with one entrance. Ball comes in there to drive home that fact. So the entire thing is like a trap. And what is this trap? It's not a supernatural trap. It seems to be some kind of cultural trap of some sort. So you can talk about the Shining being about a modernist writer trapped in postmodernity. So it's not, again, he's not dealing with humankind here. He's dealing specifically with the cultural things, dealing with America, he's dealing with modernity, postmodernity, which is a completely different thing, right? You got it? Okay. Let's look at Eyes Wide Shut. Once again, it's based on some novel by somebody. Okay. What exactly is Tom Cruise? My question is, did Tom Cruise understand the film he was acting in? What do you think? I don't think so. Okay.
I don't think anyone on that film understood what the film was.
No, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure about Nicole Kidman. Okay. Nicole Kidman may have understood. I don't think Tom Cruise got the thing. Now, the point is, he's a successful, I find it very interesting. He's a successful professional, right? He's like our own relatives in America, right? Who are all doing very well. Successful president. He's got plenty of money. He's got this and that. Okay. Interesting is, when he's invited to this Bill Harford's thing, right? Bill Harford's party, he says, why are we invited here? We don't know anybody. The
Ziegler's party.
Ziegler's party, right? Yeah. We don't know anybody in this place. Why are we invited here? Okay. His answer is, what is his answer? This is what comes out of making house calls, right? He says that. So virtually, this. He's outside his depth in that party. That Ziegler is in a different league altogether. Okay. Now, so this man this is the basic introduction. So basically, what is it about? What is this film about? Actually, if we go on talking about this, that orgy scene and this and that, it's what is the kind of music, what does it, there's all kinds of interpretations of this movie. But I found one, there's a magazine called Slant Magazine. I don't know what is this film about. It is about Tom Cruise not getting laid, I believe is the name of the meaning of the movie. Okay. Which I think is actually closer to many things. Okay.
Yes, it is about.
It's about that, right?
Yeah,
why is Tom Cruise, what exactly is Tom Cruise? So we have to look at Tom Cruise, what he represents in American cinema, right? Okay. He's not talking about Bill Harford. Tom Cruise is playing Tom Cruise in this movie. Okay. If you look at every single film of Tom Cruise, he's actually, if you look at what is that, The Firm, you look at anything, right? He's an emblem of middle class respectability, middle class morality, middle class, aspirations, middle class qualms about what is right and what is wrong. He represents the American middle class in some way, right? In this particular thing, what do you make? Okay, the entire film is about this guy. Of course, there are all kinds of
I
things
mean, now that you
included.
say it, like even casting Nicole Kidman opposite him, and they were together at that time. So
That interesting thing is, okay, the basic thing is Nicole Kidman is not American.
hmm,
She is Australian. Okay, she cannot be seen on par with
Tom
what's his
Cruise.
name, with this guy, with the Tom Cruise. So Tom Cruise, my own sense of Tom Cruise in this film is that Tom Cruise represents the middle class American, all the aspirations of the middle class American. Now we come to that orgy scene. That orgy scene, in my view, is complete nonsense. Okay, in the sense, it's nonsense in the best sense of the word, right? In the best sense of the word, what
And even
exactly is
he
it?
goes on
Okay,
to say that it was all a facade. Like towards
it's
the end.
actually, there's nothing in that orgy scene. You look at it. He says, "What were you doing there? What are you trying to do there? You know, you're some kind of, you came there. What are you trying to do?" And there are a number of scenes where there are mocking this gay, man making a pass at him in the road. You remember that scene? Another
Yeah.
place, another person making eyes at him. Tom Cruise. What are all this put there? Obviously, they're making fun of Tom Cruise in some way, right? Or that character in some way. And the character has always, got qualms about this, qualms about that. Every time the hooker tries to make some with him, and hooker sends him away. He's always sort of, he's always pushed away. Nicole Kidman is not subjected to this. Nicole Kidman is taken very seriously.
And
Tom
she's the
Cruise is
first one to
not.
push him off.
Huh?
She's the
Sorry?
first one in the film to put, like, that starts the chain of events. She's the first one to push him away.
Yeah, he pushes it. So the question is, this Tom Cruise, he's deliberately been chosen this movie to be made fun of, not as Tom Cruise, but what he represents in his other roles. And he acts in the same way, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then there are a number of scenes when Tom Cruise has got this thing of keeping his mouth open.
Yeah,
He
his
has his
teeth
mouth
is as
open, right? He keeps his mouth open, right? And when something is explained to him with care, great care, something, and this guy explains to them, and this guy's got his mouth open and he's staring. You can see that, the mockery of Tom Cruise persona in this movie. Okay, now we come to this. What exactly is this? He's a
higher
prudish
society.
character, this
Yeah.
Tom Cruise. All the prudish American middle class qualities he's got. What exactly is this higher society in the orgy? This guy Ziegler, for instance, says in a particular thing, he says, if you knew who was there in that party, right? If you knew
You
who
won't be
was there in
sleeping.
that party,
Yeah.
you would lose sleep, he says, right? He says that. Now the point I want to make is that party is the plutocracy in America. Okay. Or rather, it is not the plutocracy in America, but it is the way the plutocracy would be imagined by the professional class. You know what the plutocracy is in America, right? Okay, it
I
would
don't know what
represent
is it.
plutocracy
No.
is the ultra rich, super rich. Everybody knows that the super rich in America controls America, right? Your Jeff Bezos, your Bill Gates, your all these guys, not our CEOs, of Indian origin, but the plutocracy are all these owners. I mean, the electric car. What's this guy who's made it? All of
Tesla.
them.
Oh, sorry. That guy, Tusk, Elon
Yeah,
Musk.
Elon Musk. This chap, what's his name? Warren Buffett. Okay, this entire lot, the plutocracy, who have huge amounts of money, and generally it is known. Your what are they called? This Goldman Sachs. These are the guys, right? So they virtually control. Everybody has jumps in some sense that America is not the democracy it claims to be. That it's basically controlled by these huge business interests. There are some of these, Renaissance technologies, many of these guys, right? They have, I mean, enormous wealth. The kind of wealth which they have, So the question is, this society which the professional wants to belong in is left excluded to him, right? Okay. He is shut out of the society, and it is that society of the plutocracy as imagined. This entire orgy scene is actually the plutocracy as imagined by the middle class. Okay. So actually, what is the film? It's actually a satire, right? It's a satire about the controlling classes in America. It's about the relationship between classes. But the point is, this movie will not go down well if it's understood for what it is, right?
Yeah, and people complain about that film that it's not realistic, and it's not supposed to be realistic. I mean,
Okay.
the way
I
it's
think okay,
shot and
okay, all
everything.
right. Let me. Okay. Is that all right now? Yeah, I think it's okay. Okay. Maybe a little bit. Okay. All right. So okay. So the question is that it seems to be this Kubrick seems to be generally okay. concealing the fact that he's being satirical, he's making fun of America, is doing that. Okay, there's a lot of stuff in this film like that. Okay, he's concealed the. I mean, he's not very even you look at something like Shining also. I mean, there seems to be a general feeling that general sense that Kubrick is not doesn't want it to be known that his movies are satirical. All right, he doesn't really. He's not unlike your this one, Doctor Strangelove, which is straightforward satire. He is concealing the fact. I don't know what the reason is, but I think that if people really understood Eyes Wide Shut the way I am look, I mean, there are certain looks that what's her name, Nicole Kidman gives at the end of the film and all that, which take away from my interpretation of it. But Kubrick always does this. There are elements there which can't be explained. I don't know exactly what the relationship. He doesn't make tight movies in the sense of fully explaining every single thing, fully submitting to any explanation. Okay, that is my sense of it. But I think if generally this kind of explanation came to be known that this is basically what this film is about, I don't think it will go down particularly well. Which is why there are all these things of some that music which he plays is some Romanian liturgy played backwards, I believe. Okay, there is Indian music. I think there's some Carnatic music also in that orgy scene.
Yeah. Where he passes through the halls.
Definitely, you look at it. You look at the film. Okay, what is that? Who is there present in the orgy? Okay, who is present in the orgy scene apart from this guy? Apart from Tom Cruise? Any idea who are the guys who are present in the orgy scene?
There was this Ziegler guy. There was the that.
No. All of them are the super rich plutocracy elements and hookers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Only hookers, right?
Yeah.
Hookers and and the plutocracy. Okay. So this guy has no place in that at all. He's turned out and thrown out. Of course, that Nightingale is there. Okay. And even that Nightingale, what Nightingale? Bill Nightingale? I know something
Nick
Nightingale.
Nightingale.
Nick Nightingale. He's there. But Nick Nightingale, they think he's been killed or some such thing, that other hooker has been killed. But actually, it's not the case. They've died naturally. She's died a natural death, and Nick Nightingale has gone back to wherever he came from. This Ziegler assures him, right? And there is no reason for us to disbelieve Ziegler, right?
Yeah.
There's no reason
There's
at all.
no reason for us to believe him as well.
No, but the question is, I think, like in the film, okay, there is nothing to tell us that Ziegler is lying, right? There's nothing to say that. Okay. It could very well be the truth. And Ziegler is a very convincing guy. Who plays him? I think the other director, Sidney Pollack, right? Sidney Pollack played that role. So the question I'm trying to, my basic thing about this Eyes Wide Shut is basically a satire on the American system. Okay. The middle class, which believes it's doing well, which is thing in a democracy, has plenty of money. And the other side, you've got the super rich, which lives at a different level altogether. Okay. Their entire dreams of this middle class, okay, is basically somewhat they're living in some kind of situation where somebody else is on top, some kind of thing. It's a kind of political satire about this the middle class and the super class or whatever, super rich plutocrats. Okay, and it should be seen as that seems makes the most interesting thing. Otherwise, I mean, what are we to make of this film at all? Okay, so which is why I think that he's becoming more and more and more what is the word, Kubrick at the end of his life. I don't think he had much faith. That movie was not even made in America. It was made in, I believe, even the New York scenes were shot in England. Okay. Yeah, it was
Except for a
shot.
few
Okay.
establishing shots here and there.
Yeah. Okay. So the question is, that sort of thing. So the question is that this is my sense of Kubrick's satirical, but by and large, when he's dealing with humanity, okay, he suspect because he takes his position well above humanity. But when he's dealing with something like America, when he's dealing with culture, when he's dealing with local this thing, okay, that he makes much more sense that there is really an acid vision there, and there's something quite profound that he's saying. Though of course he's not pakka in the sense of being absolutely watertight in his plotting and all that. He puts in elements there which we can't interpret. He puts in all kinds of things. I think a lot of there is in Eyes Wide Shut as well, because he borrows selectively from what he does, but he puts in stuff which does not point to shall we say, a very a very sharp interpretation. You cannot interpret him so sharply. So the question is, he's impeccable in his technical thing and all that, and is hypnotic, the kind of quality that something like The Shining or Eyes Wide Shut. But otherwise, the issue is, can you interpret his film? Is the issue? Is interpret his film completely rigorously? Is the issue? So having said that, I'll stop. Any questions up to here? I don't like that Lolita adaptation at all. I think, the whole problem with this adaptation of Lolita is, first of all, this guy is James Mason is not Humbert Humbert. See, Lolita is a great novel, right? It's sensuous. It's a literary masterpiece, right? It's the kind of his use of language itself. I don't know what he did this, and I'm not happy with this. Yeah, yeah. It's no. In fact, I would tell. I didn't even bring it up. Okay, I didn't even bring up that film. I don't like. I think Nabokov was reasonably happy with the thing, but Nabokov he would have been happy with many things, I think.
But don't you think,
So
like at the time it was made with the kind of studio system that was prevalent at the time, the kind of sensitivity that he dealt with the material, like it was almost considered pornography in some countries.
yeah, that's
The source
true.
material.
But yeah, but I'm saying, I mean, if you look at the novel, that novel is, I mean, it's, I don't know if you've read the novel. It's delirious is the word to write about that novel, the way it's written. Okay, what can you do? You can't simply turn it into a story. The way that is written, the novel is written, it's, I mean, it's ecstatic is the word for the kind of language he has. What would you do with it? And I'll tell you this, making fun of the idea of Lolita. I don't think so. I don't
No,
know.
yeah.
No, I'm not so sure. No, I'll tell you. First of all, Nabokov is far too knowing and far too clever a writer to be treated anyway, because there's too much of satire in Nabokov himself, right? He's making fun of America all the time. Okay, for Charlotte Hayes, for instance, Charlotte Hayes, the wife the one he marries, Humbert marries. Charlotte Hayes is he? I mean, Charlotte Hayes. You remember Charlotte Hayes' death in a traffic accident? She dies. He does something. He's trying to do. I mean, and she finds his diary. He's written all his thoughts for that daughter. He's written a diary, and she finds that diary, and she rushes out. Okay, he tries to convince her that it's actually a thing for a novel. It's an idea for a novel, but she rushes out. Okay, and she's hit by a car. She's hit by a car and dies. And then after that, that car driver, I remember that scene. The car driver comes along with a map he has drawn, the car's trajectory, wife's trajectory, and with dotted lines to show how a wife went after she was hit by the car, how the car went, and all that. And he says, Humbert says, as my stepdaughter would have said, the map was a beaut. Now, that is savage, right?
True.
Is savage. I mean, it's savage. You can't make fun of that. It's already far too savage a satire for you to make fun of that. That is my feeling. Okay, it won't lend itself. Lolita is already too satirical. I mean, it's not wholehearted satire. There's lots more in it. But the point is, it's already far too sharp a satire for it to be made fun of in some other way. To take
What
a
do you think of
position
Barry
somewhere
Lyndon?
outside.
What do you
Huh?
think of Barry Lyndon?
I liked it very much. But I don't know. I mean, in the sense that it's not as provocative as the other films, right? It's
But
it's a, it's
that
a
human
fairly
element that
faithful
you're
thing.
talking
Huh?
about, that human element that you're talking about, like the human stance. What
Yeah,
about that?
correct. This is the thing. Among the things, various things. What exactly is the grave of Indians? What to make of that? I don't know what to make of it actually. That it's a Indian grave, whatever. See, that this is the thing about Kubrick. I said there are so many elements in Kubrick's films that one can't. I mean, my interpretation will not support that at all. What you said about the Indian graves, right? But the point is, what you make of the film? How does he? But one thing is there, his satirical vision. There's no doubt at all. But the question is, what is he making fun of? Okay, once you say it's satirical vision, okay, because he's always making fun of everything. Jack Nicholson is basically, he's actually a comic actor of some sort. He always does, overdoes everything. I mean, so the question is, once you say he's mocking something, then your question is, what is he mocking, right? In the other films, it's not very. This one in Lolita, I have serious problems with that James Mason. In fact, I'll tell you, I thought the film was all right until he gives a laugh of some sort. James Mason gives a laugh. Some wife says something, and he says something, and he laughs in a very, in a very uh, prolonged laugh, peals of laughter, which I found quite, James Mason was not okay. James Mason is good for bit roles. He's terrific in bit roles. He's like De Niro in many ways. De Niro, nobody seems to agree with me, but he's very good in bit roles. You give him a full length role, he doesn't seem to sort of come to terms with it. So it's a lot of people like this who can't do full length roles. Okay, they're good for small roles and character roles and that sort of thing. And James Mason is very good for that. He's very good as villain in Hitchcock's films and all that. I'm not happy with James Mason as a lead actor at all. So it's a problem. Lolita has got all these problems. I'm not happy with the film. And Peter Sellers, I think I don't know what. No, Peter Sellers is basically, what is the word I would? He impersonates things, right? Of course, that Quilty, I don't know what to make of it. He's an impersonator. He's not an actor so much. So when he does 3 or 4 different roles, we like to watch Peter Sellers doing 3 different roles unrecognizably. We don't sell him. We don't understand them as characters in some way. This is a problem. Quilty, every time is repeating in a different way. I have always have problems. Peter Sellers is a great entertainer. Like Shah Rukh Khan, he can in what is that? Om Shanti Om is a terrific entertainer. But is he a terrific actor? I don't know. I'm not so sure that Peter Sellers is a great actor. I'm not. Okay.
Thank you so much, guys. Thank you so much for joining in.